He stood in the silent, temperature-controlled vault, surrounded by $1 billion of other people's hope. And he realized the entire empire was held together by one single, perfect lie.
Elias Thorne did not manage chaos, he eradicated the possibility of it. His office, 78 floors above Manhattan, was less a place of business and more a climate-controlled study in absolute efficiency.
The air always felt filtered, the light calibrated, the sound suppressed. Elias dealt in billions, but his true commodity was perception.
At 39, he was the face of modern ethical capitalism. The Thorne Foundation provided clean water to villages and funded educational reform. He was celebrated on panels, lauded by presidents.
His empire, Thorne Industries, was vast, touching commodities, tech infrastructure, and, subtly, municipal bonds. It was the machine that fed the foundation.
And Elias knew with crystalline clarity that the machine ran on a specific grade of human silence.
He preferred the early hours. Before dawn, the city was just a hum beneath his feet. He would review the internal reports. The numbers always balanced. The optics were flawless.
He had constructed his life and his legacy as an unbreakable feedback loop. Ruthlessness secured the wealth bought the reputation, and the reputation ensured more ruthlessness could proceed unnoticed.
Control was simply foresight applied without mercy. The foundation gala was mandatory theater. White linen, subdued lighting, the predictable symphony of flattery. Elias moved through the room, a pillar of calm amidst the swirling anxiety of the aspirational rich.
He knew every smile, every handshake had a decimal point attached.
Then he met Clara Vance. She was not part of the ecosystem. She was a journalist, and not the type who wrote glowing profiles for glossy magazines. She worked for an independent investigative collective, the kind of operation that preferred footnotes to flashbulbs. She wore a dress that suggested competence, not trend. Her eyes, steel gray, did not carry admiration, they carried calculation. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low, measured, devoid of the breathless awe he was accustomed to. "I appreciate your foundation's work in infrastructure. Remarkable reach. But I'm interested in the source." Elias offered the practiced, polite smile that signaled end of. "We believe in giving back, Miss Vance. Simple as that." "Simple is rarely true in this city," she countered, letting the silence hang slightly too long. "I'm looking at the upstream economics, the commodities trading that funds this scale of giving." Specifically, the land acquisition around the old Sterling chemical site 15 years ago, just before the environmental regulations. A subtle crack appeared, the first faint line on the perfect glass surface. Elias felt the familiar, cold flicker of protective instinct. Sterling Chemical had been the most profitable and most ethically ambiguous acquisition in Thorne Industries' history. It was the bedrock. "Ancient history, Miss Vance," he replied, his tone remaining even. "A necessary." "History has consequences, Mr. Thorne," she pressed, leaning slightly closer. "Especially when the clean water you donate flows past the groundwater you allegedly contaminated to buy the land." He looked at her, truly looked at her. She wasn't seeking a headline, she was seeking parity. He had spent 2 decades ensuring no one could stand on equal footing with him. Yet here she was, standing on the evidence. The attraction was instantaneous, toxic, and absolutely distracting. It was not the superficial spark of 2 people meeting. It was the profound recognition of 2 apex predators, one focused on the hunt, the other focused on the defense. He saw the integrity in her eyes, the rigid, unforgiving quality that mirrored his own disciplined control. Except her discipline was directed outward, toward truth. His was directed inward, toward suppression. He found himself wanting to talk to her again. A mistake. Control meant keeping potential threats at a distance. But Clara was not a standard threat. She was a psychological challenge. He arranged a follow-up interview under the guise of transparency. Their meetings became frequent,
always ostensibly professional, held in neutral spaces, a quiet library reading room, a low-key diner far from the financial district. She spoke of systemic neglect. He spoke of necessary compromise.
"You save thousands of lives, Elias," she said one evening, stirring lukewarm tea. "But you break 100 to pay for it. Does the math justify thee?" "The wreckage," he said, holding her gaze, "is already there. I simply repurposed the debris. If I didn't fund the foundation with the scale of Thorn Industries' profits, who would fund it? No one else."
"That is the classic justification of the powerful," Clara observed calmly. "That only your specific corruption can produce your specific—"
He admired her precision. She was peeling back the layers of his carefully constructed persona, not with rage, but with surgical patience. He realized he was falling in love with the architect of his potential downfall.
The silence between them grew heavy, weighted with the secrets he kept and the truths she pursued. It was a shared, dangerous intimacy.
The foundation continued its work, spotless and lauded. Elias continued to manage the machine, relentless and unseen. But now the machine felt heavier. The perfect stillness of his office was disturbed by the memory of Clara's challenging silence.
This subtle crack began to widen.
Clara was getting closer to the source documentation for the Sterling deal. She had interviewed 3 former employees, all bound by stringent NDAs, all living with the quiet anxiety of having witnessed something irreversible. One of them, a retired logistics manager named Robert, had held back a ledger detailing the exact costs of the accelerated cleanup, the costs that were officially not paid, saving Thorn Industries hundreds of millions, while ensuring the local contamination lingered, subtle and long-term.
Elias had his security team run a deep scan on Clara's movements, a necessary precaution, he told himself. He wasn't tracking her, he was protecting his assets.
But the internal surveillance reports began to feel like love notes read through a magnifying glass.
One afternoon, a sealed package arrived on his desk, no return address. Inside, there was a single photocopied page. It was a page from Robert's private ledger.
A handwritten annotation clearly linked the unspent cleanup funds directly to the initial seed money for the Thorn Foundation's very first major project.
The line was drawn, stark and undeniable. The foundation's genesis was paid for in hidden toxins.
Elias sat motionless. The silence in the office was deafening. He didn't feel panic. Panic was for the uncontrolled. He felt a profound, cold certainty.
He had always known the truth intellectually, but seeing it manifest on paper, bridging the 2 distinct parts of his life, the ethical savior and the corporate predator, was an irreversible event.
More critically, Robert had been Clara's source. If Robert had given Elias 1 page, he had certainly given Clara the entire book. She knew. The high-stakes emotional punch arrived not as a sudden blow, but as a creeping paralysis. His meticulous control was dissolving, not because of an external threat, but because of an internal conflict.
He had to choose between the system he had built and the woman who threatened to dismantle it.
He called her. The reading room tonight.
She arrived exactly at midnight, carrying a briefcase that looked heavier than it should have. The air between them was electric, thick with unspoken accusation and undeniable connection.
"You have the ledger," Elias stated, bypassing any preamble.
Clara did not confirm or deny. She simply placed the briefcase on the small wooden table. "I have enough to explain why the Sterling site still reports elevated health incidents 15 years later."
I have enough to explain where the initial capital came. And what will you do with? He asked. The question was not adversarial. It was genuinely curious. He wanted to know the path her integrity would choose.
"I will publish the truth, Elias. That is my—"
"The truth costs something," he replied, leaning back. "It costs the foundation. It costs the clean water projects. It costs the schools we fund. You will destroy the good, along with the—"
"And you will keep doing the bad," Clara countered, her voice steady.
to keep the good running. You've created a perpetual motion machine of moral debt, and the truth, Elias, is the only currency that matters to.
He looked at her hands, resting on the worn leather of the briefcase. He saw his own ambition reflected in her absolute refusal to compromise. He knew, intimately, the psychological toll of compromise. He had lived it for 2 decades.
"I love you, Claire," he said, the words heavy and awkward on his tongue, unused to genuine emotion. She met his gaze, the steel in her eyes softening only fractionally. "I know, and I think that is the only part of this you didn't control. It's what makes your silence so expensive."
Elias realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was utterly cornered. He could deploy his legal defense team, destroy Robert, discredit Clara, delay the story for months, and maintain his empire.
But the cost would be the total eradication of his own already fragile internal state. He would become purely the facade, the lie that held the vault together. The internal collapse was quiet, occurring not with shouting or despair, but with a deep, cleansing subtraction.
He stood up, walked to the window, and looked down at the grid of the city lights, the lights that represented millions of oblivious lives, many of whom benefited directly from his corrupt wealth.
"You are right," he said, turning back to her. "The wreckage is my design, and the debt must be paid in—"
He did not argue further. He did not plead for time. He did not ask her to protect him or the foundation. He understood that the greatest act of control he could now perform was the complete surrender of control. Over the next 72 hours, Elias Thorne performed the methodical dismantling of his own life.
He instructed his chief operating officer to release all archived documentation related to the Sterling Chemical site, categorized, indexed, and fully auditable. He bypassed the legal team, knowing they were built to fight, not to submit. He informed the board in a tersely worded email sent at 3 a.m. that a full independent audit of all acquisition funds tied to the foundation was imminent and unavoidable. The shockwaves that ripped through the finance world were seismic.
He sat in his pristine, silent office and drafted his own statement. It was not a defense. It was an inventory. He listed the philanthropic triumphs alongside the predatory costs, detailing the specific communities harmed to fund the massive charitable endowments. He didn't use flowery language or apology. He simply stated the facts of the trade-off he had engineered.
He had one final meeting with Clara, not at the library, but at the foundation headquarters, sitting in the enormous polished marble lobby where his name was carved into the cornerstone. "This is the final installment of your story," he told her, handing over a thick manila envelope containing the full corporate confession, signed and notarized. "It is the truth, without filters. Use it exactly as you—"
She took the envelope, her expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do this, Elias. You could have buried."
"I could have buried the truth," he corrected. "I couldn't bury the fact that I needed to stop performing. The silence was the real currency. Now it is time to spend." The announcement was published simultaneously with the release of the documents. The reaction was immediate and brutal. The Thorne Foundation assets were frozen pending investigation. Thorne Industries stock plummeted. Elias Thorne, the ethical billionaire, became Elias Thorne, the corporate felon. He was stripped of his titles, his access codes, and his reputation in less than a week.
The irony was profound. His confession saved the foundation's structure, ensuring the money would still flow to the communities, but it cost him every molecule of personal wealth and liberty. He did not fight the charges.
He pleaded guilty to regulatory fraud and environmental negligence. The transition to a stark, simple holding cell was jarring, yet strangely anticlimactic. The cold metal and the institutional quiet were a stark contrast to the luxurious silence of his penthouse, yet the effect was the same: isolation.
But this isolation was earned. In the first 48 hours of confinement, Elias Thorne finally experienced the restrained transformation. He was gone, the mask, the performer, the architect of global perception.
What remained
was simply a man facing the consequences of his choices.
He remembered a small, worn dollar bill he had kept pressed under the glass of his desk for years, a relic from his youth. It was the first dollar he had ever earned, cleaning shoes outside a subway entrance.
He had forgotten the dollar's physical presence, but he remembered the feeling it represented, the simple transaction of effort for value, untainted by complexity or corruption. Now he had nothing, not even that memory of tangible solvency.
He sat on the narrow cot, the overhead fluorescent light buzzing slightly, a sound he would never have permitted in his controlled world. He was ruined financially, legally, and socially.
He had lost the woman he loved, driven away by the chasm of his own deceit, even as she used his confession to achieve the height of her professional mission.
But he was free of the perpetual burden of maintaining the perfect lie. The responsibility of millions of lives tethered to the engine of his moral compromise was gone.
That night, for the first time since he was a restless, ambitious teenager dreaming of global conquest, Elias Thorne slept. Deeply, dreamlessly.
He woke to the sound of a closing door and the dull murmur of institution. He wasn't Elias Thorne, the man who shaped continents with a phone call. He was just a number now. He looked at his hands. They were empty.
The control was external now, enforced by concrete and wire. The weight was gone.
He realized that the true last dollar he possessed was not a physical currency. It was the final, total surrender of the need for self-justification. He had spent his entire life accumulating power to avoid the consequence of truth.
Now, having paid the full price, he understood that silence, when earned through confession, was not expensive. It was priceless. He had traded everything external for the internal quiet he never knew he craved.
He thought of Clara, now internationally recognized for breaking one of the biggest corporate corruption stories of the decade. She had asked him once if the math justified the wreckage. He finally had the answer.
The only equation that balanced was the one that ended with him, stripped bare.
The guard passed by the small window, his boot silent on the linoleum. Elias closed his eyes again, savoring the unfamiliar, profound relief of utter insignificance.
We spend our lives chasing empires, convinced that the summit is where the air is purest, only to discover that moral solvency exists only in the valley of consequences. Next week, we examine the sealed files of Senator Maxwell T., the man who claimed to value transparency above all else.
His political career crumbled not because of the lie he told, but because of the inconvenient truth he refused to acknowledge about his wife. What happens when the cost of public office demands the destruction of private love?
Do not miss the full account of the Maxwell T. scandal.